Welcome to our webinar. My name is Steve Lesser. I'm a Florida board certified construction lawyer and I chair the construction law group at Becker, and I will serve as your moderator today. Dealing with the pandemic and the decisions made to reopen facilities, as our title suggests, can be risky business, but not only to residents of your community, to patrons of your facilities from a health safety standpoint, but what we do now may chart the course of how you do in the future with respect to your business or your community. If proper procedures are not followed, people may not be confident that they could come in to your facilities and feel safe, especially when you have government regulations. If people aren't watching out for you then, how will you expect them to watch out for you then afterwards? So what we want to do is we want to make sure that in the aftermath of this pandemic, people come back, people visit your facilities, and the employees come back to work knowing that they feel safe. History tells us that until we face a dilemma and a situation like we have now, maybe we won't learn the lessons that are needed to be learned as a result of it. Take Hurricane Andrew for an example. Before Hurricane Andrew, no one was really prepared for hurricane season. Now, hurricane season is a way of life. People within a community have new roofs, they have hurricane glass, they have shutters, they have in-house generators. They know that before a hurricane hits, to remove the debris around their home so they won't strike their neighbors, we know what to do. The same is true for this pandemic. And we have learned some lessons that we want to share with you. Now, we have over 1,200 registrants for today's webinar. And over the last day or two, they have been peppering us with a lot of questions. Questions such as, when can we reopen the pool? Can I allow movers to come in? What do I do with Amazon deliveries? What about a deep cleaning? What is required? Can we be restricted from visiting our spa or our gym? And our answer to these questions, including the one question everybody seems to ask is, when will all this be over? The answer to that is, well, we don't know. But we feel that we can give you some guidance on what we need to do in the aftermath of this so that when we get back to normal, that people will be safe and feel comfortable using your facilities when we reopen. So with that, we have a great panel of experts that can assist you in figuring out the answers to these questions and get some guidance along the way. First of all on our panel is my partner, Ken, Direktor. Ken has been a community association lawyer for over 25 years for Becker. He runs a community association practice group. He's seen every crazy thing that goes on in these community associations for the last 25 years. And in fact, the last 60 days, he has been very busy answering your questions and guiding clients on how to maneuver through this pandemic. We're also fortunate to have one of the leading nation's top restoration companies in the country, Signal Restoration. We have Keith and Clay Hernandez. Keith and Clay and their company specialize in handling restoration for communities, theaters, factories, plants, condominiums, all over the country and in the state of Florida. We're going to learn from them about some of the products that they use, some of the procedures and protocols that they've established when sanitizing these facilities in the aftermath of COVID-19. So let's get started. Let's generally talk about reopening. I will tell you, the other day I went to get a haircut and they pointed a thermometer at my head and they wouldn't let me in unless I succumbed to that, which I did, of course. And then I went to my gym yesterday that opened up for the first time. I've been paying my dues even though they've been closed. And they hand me this waiver form. And I look at it and I say, well, maybe I shouldn't even sign this thing because, hey, they can't restrict me from coming in. That wasn't part of my deal. After all, I pay the money to join. Why do I need to sign a waiver? Right now, people are getting sued for opening too soon, and they're being sued for not opening up soon enough. So, Ken, in light of all this, from your standpoint, what guidance can you give us about opening the communities? Can a business or a condominium, can they restrict us from using the facilities the way we think that we should be able to use them?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. We are still under a state of emergency. We are still in a situation where we have an active virus, and we are still in a situation where the elderly and those with underlying health conditions are still at risk. Whether you believe this is a pandemic or whether you believe those that are saying it's some sort of a overblown flu season, the bottom line is that the board has an obligation to protect the residents and the staff. As long as we are under a state of emergency, most lawyers would agree that the board has the authority to exercise what are called emergency powers under the statute. Some will debate that because it's a statute that was enacted for post-hurricane situations, but the vast majority of attorneys are in agreement that the emergency powers are in fact available to the board. Secondly, the board has the authority under Florida law to exercise what is called prudent business judgments. Courts are reticent to second guess a board exercising its business judgment. So how do you approach reopening with the notion that you have emergency powers and on the other hand, you have the right to exercise business judgment? And what we are seeing is that the decision to close facilities, which was pretty challenging in and of itself, is nothing compared to the decisions that are facing you now in terms of how and when and how much to reopen. You're getting pressure, as Steve pointed out, from both sides. There are those who want the building to remain closed off. There are those who want their housekeepers, their movers, their contractors. The best advice I can give you as an opening comment to this webinar is there is no one size that fits all. You have to take a look at the physical layout of your community and the demographic. The more at risk your residents are because of their age or infirmities, the more careful you need to be. If you don't have a freight elevator, then maybe you shouldn't be allowing unlimited freight to go up and down the passenger elevators. If you have outdoor hallways as opposed to indoor hallways, that may promote a little bit more flexibility because the interior is where the problems are most likely to arise. I cannot urge you strongly enough, talk to each other, talk to any medical professionals that are available to you to consult, read the CDC guidelines, talk to the local Department of Health, and talk to your counsel about what factors you should consider with regard to how and when to reopen.
Well, Ken, those are all really good things. I mean, we all know the usual things, limits on the congregation of people in one place. Now they've opened it up to phase one. Mostly you can congregate in 50 people at this point in time. Have face masks, have hand sanitizer. But I think what your point is, tell me if I'm wrong about this, but you're taking a conservative approach here. That safety is the utmost concern here. And if you exercise the most conservative view, you'll be in good shape. Is that what your point is?
Well, the downside of maintaining restrictions is inconvenience and, of course, potential financial consequence to some of your owners. The downside of opening too soon is far more serious. That's the bottom line. Life safety has to come first.
Well, what if you have, Ken, and you're in a 55 and over community, or you have some elderly people residing in your residence and they need a housekeeper to come over routinely to do routine things for them, and the condominium says, we're not letting any visitors in. How do we handle that situation? What do you suggest we do?
Well, I do believe the board has the authority under emergency powers to restrict access, but again, those powers have to be exercised reasonably. So, on the one hand, compare a housekeeper coming in to a construction crew coming in for 3 weeks. One is certainly going to be viewed as a greater risk. There are buildings that never stop the housekeepers from coming in, and there are buildings that still at this date are only now opening up to housekeepers. It really depends upon the needs. For example, you may have elderly residents who simply need the assistance because they can't keep their unit sanitary. That would certainly be a consideration. From the beginning, from the inception of these restrictions, the traditional approach has been you cannot have non-essential visitors. You could have a necessary caregiver. You could have somebody come in to do emergency repairs, like if your refrigerator stopped working or your air conditioner stopped working. And where we are going from there is we are easing our way back into a more permissive approach to allowing access to the building. Housekeepers are, I suppose, a logical first step. As long as they are required to come in and out through one entrance, they aren't on the common elements other than to go to and from the unit and their car. They wear a face covering when they're on the common elements. These are all restrictions that you can impose as you allow access to make sure that the people who are now coming in come in under some set of defined guidelines for how to best protect the safety of the residents and the staff.
So what do you say that if you're trying, you mentioned the business judgment rule, of course, which means that you can rely upon your professionals when making a move. But would you also suggest that you have certain committees established within a community to discuss and vet out these various considerations, so it's not just one person making the decision and then the whole community is in jeopardy because of that decision if it's the wrong one?
Well, the committee should be first and foremost the board. We have, right now we're on a Zoom conference. I imagine a lot of you out there have now had experience with conducting meetings digitally. You may never go back to in-person meetings, a lot of you. The decisions should be made at the board level. They should be made with the same degree of formality as most board decisions are made. The emphasis has to be on being nimble, being flexible, and communicating. I have recommended to the vast majority of my clients that these protocols should be revisited almost on a weekly basis because the situation is fluid. The situation ebbs and flows. The needs of your residents ebb and flow. So you need to keep the owners advised as to what the factors are that you're considering, and you need to be willing to take a look at your restrictions as the situation evolves, because you have the unenviable task of balancing your need to protect your staff and your residents on the one hand, and also not unduly restrict their ability to use their units or do necessary repairs or renovations. And that's a very tough balance to strike right now.
You know, you raise a good point. This doesn't only concern community association, it concerns businesses who have to communicate with their patrons as well as their employees to let them know what's going on. But I can see a situation arising where people who have a membership in a country club, like I mentioned in the gym earlier, they pay a lot of money every month to be a member there, and all of a sudden they can't use the facilities. Some people don't take this seriously. Some people take it very seriously. That's why you have lawsuits for not opening, and you have lawsuits for, you know, being closed. But what do you suggest in terms of the frequency of your communication? How do you get that out? Because it seems to me that oftentimes when people don't know what's going on, that's when people tend to complain and get a little bit more riled up.
The more you communicate, the less room there is for rumor and skepticism to rule the roost. If you do not communicate with your residents, trust me, someone will step into that vacuum and tell their own version of what's going on. I think it's worth pointing out that there is a misconception out there that because restaurants and salons and other businesses are reopening, that the association is obligated to reopen facilities. I want to point out that these orders permit the association to reopen. They do not mandate it. And I think it's also worth remembering that the people who go to the newly reopened businesses and restaurants and salons, they do so voluntarily. But your residents who are stuck there and are still quarantining because they're at high risk, if you allow people in and expose them to people from outside, that's not something that they're choosing to do. That's something that the board is choosing to expose them to, which is why a certain degree of care must still be exercised as we reopen.
You know, I was reading an article the other day, they talk about our hotels safe. And someone made the point that the real jeopardy here is not going to a hotel room and get it from touching something, although Keith and Clay will weigh on that in a minute when we talk about the cleaning process, but it's always from transmission between people in close proximity to one another. And I think that's what you really need to be careful of, especially in the older communities or in Palm Beach County where you have a lot of older residents. And if they open the restaurants and people are not practicing social distancing and they're not following guidelines and the business is not enforcing those guidelines, then I think that's where you have some problems. So what have you seen in terms of reasonable restrictions in these communities? Are the thermometers okay to be using? What do you recommend that would be reasonable, and what have you seen work?
Well, for example, thermometers are an appropriate protocol, but let's not kid ourselves into thinking that they are dispositive of the question of whether or not someone is infected. The rumors I hear, and if you look at the numbers in terms of the number of cases and the number of fatalities, and we're just using fatalities, but what percentage of people who have this virus and have had it over the past couple months are asymptomatic? It's a large percentage. So taking someone's temperature doesn't necessarily answer the question. It's not a reliable diagnosis. So the best way to protect your residents is not to take their temperature The best way to protect your residents is to continue to control access, and to the extent you permit access, to impose guidelines so that people who are coming into and out of the building spend minimal time on the interior common elements, and if necessary, wear gloves, wear face coverings, do whatever is necessary to mitigate their impact on the community. And as you correctly point out, Steve, mitigate the risk of person-to-person transmission.
All right. Well, look, Ken, you have outlined a lot of safety issues that are really important here that we all need to know about. We know about a lot of those, about the face coverings and the sanitizing, but I want to discuss cleaning for a minute, because this is where the signal guys get involved and where we have to rely upon their expertise. Because some people, when I've talked to them, because a lot of my construction clients come to me and they say, should we disinfect the facilities? Should we clean it? Why do we need a specialized cleaning company? Why can't my own people do the cleaning out here? What's so special about what companies like Signal does? Will they make my facility safe? Why should, Keith, these people use Signal or another type of restoration company to clean their facilities? What's the difference?
Thanks, Steve. I think one of the areas that you need to think about here is that, historically, janitorial or cleaning services have been used to really make facilities look clean, not necessarily to make them safe from pathogens like COVID. So businesses and HOAs and boards need to be thinking about this practice from two different angles. I think you guys mentioned on both of those. And the first is, providing customers and employees confidence in returning to the facilities. But more importantly, they need to take it a step further and really think about their employee and resident safety to that extent. If you look at the documentation from the CDC and others and the government agencies, they can describe the cleaning process, and it sounds more like standard cleaning. But in reality, when you're dealing with like COVID, we're looking at it as more of a biohazard remediation. And in terms of that, we're thinking about, removal and cleaning and disinfecting of bodily fluids and other harmful pathogens that could be and could result in death, accident, or other items. And because of the high exposure risk to the pathogens, biohazard remediation is one that requires, specific proper training and equipment in order to be effective for a facility to be clean.
Well, I think I understand what you're saying. It's more of a sophisticated or more diligent type cleaning. But Keith, what about the simple things like arranging for trash to be removed more frequently? That seems to be a hazardous spot that needs to be attended to in any type of cleaning program. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we're still learning about, what the length of the residual effects of the COVID virus are on various items. And so, from a safety standpoint, contractors or others should be removing trash so that it's not left behind, because you just don't know how the disease is going to be transmitted. We're learning more and more about it. And it's, obviously more likely to receive it from engagement and from communicable between two people. But, there is that opportunity for it to reside on a item, whether it be a package or waste or, a high touch point area. And so it's just, from exude enough safety and concern around that to make sure that those items are removed.
When you talk about this concept, can you tell us a little bit more about the training of your people and how they have some specific training protocol they go through before you put them onto the spot?
Right. So, I mean, well, I'll be honest here, COVID is a new disease and out there. And so there's no specific qualification or certification for the COVID-19 virus. However, we would recommend when looking at a contractor or anybody in terms of the cleaning that they have some familiarity and training in biohazard remediation or hospital grade cleaning techniques. Our firm has a lot of our folks are trained in this. We belong to a group called the Global Biorisk Advisory Council, GBAC. They provide training for that. And doing some additional research, I know that other janitorial services and associations like the International Janitorial Cleaning Services Association provide these specific biohazard cleaning training and familiarization. And so as folks are looking at their cleaning crews, they should try and understand if those contractors have those training protocols or practices and certifications in order to feel like they have got the right partner.
Well, talk about that. So I'm a construction lawyer, and anytime that my client's hiring a contractor, the first thing that comes up is licensing, because Florida is a very tough licensing state. I mean, you basically cannot step foot on a construction job and do anything without having the appropriate license, whether it is a roofing license, a swimming pool license. General contractors can do so much, but in Florida, you can't offer even contract or perform work unless you have a designated license. So I'm wondering, from your standpoint, maybe you can enlighten the audience. If you come to them and they want to hire somebody like your firm, what licenses are you required to have in Florida, if any?
Yeah, I mean, we're following the practices of the state. In terms of cleaning, Steve, I don't think there are any specific licenses that I'm aware of from our firm. So we're following the normal practice of being registered in the state, having a contractor's license, and that's really the prominent information that I know there. Clay, I don't know if you've got other particular experience from your experience in Florida.
No, there's no particular license for this type of work. People that are familiar with mold licenses and the type of work that's involved with mold, as far as containment, setting up engineering controls, a similar type of thing to asbestos work, where you're really trying to contain the hazard. Those type of licenses lend itself well to this type of work, but specifically to pathogen and cleaning and sanitizing and disinfecting, there are no licenses required anywhere. This is new to everybody.
Okay, so in light of it's new, I'm sure that experience matters, of course. Everybody's on the starting ground of this, but certainly with the background in restoration work that you've done for a long period of time, that helps clients understand who they might hire or not. What other thoughts, Clay, do you have with respect to removing contaminants such as trash removal? What considerations do you think are important for people to know when they hire a restoration company as yours in terms of the training and experience of the personnel?
Well, to your first question, Steve, what I would really pay attention to when it comes to trash removal, and the guidelines for the trash removal, it's not considered to be treated as medical waste and requires a licensed contractor to haul it to an incinerator. So it's not medical biohazard waste in a sense. But I think where you have exposure is where the person that is literally taking the trash out of the trash bin, I think is where you have your most exposure. I think that that person should be properly trained in making sure that that bag is closed and sealed tight before it's taken out of its bin. At the very minimum, that person should have a mask on and gloves. Once that it's been disposed of, they should take those gloves off and wash their hands and put a new set of gloves on. So I think that the little things like that really need to be paid attention to when you're just doing something as simple as removing trash from the inside of a building. Now, to your second point, I think that there's quite a few contractors out there that are doing this type of work now. If I was a resident or if I was a HOA trying to look at hiring some of these folks, I would definitely ask for references, and I would ask for experience in COVID-19 cleaning particularly. What jobs have they done, and can I have references to verify that the work has been done?
What about having the proper protective gear, for example? I know that's a big important point that you have. Are your people properly wearing the right gear? Are they cleaning in terms of going after, just surface cleaning? I know that Ken received a question just this morning about how one of the latest ordinances talked about doing a deep cleaning, whatever that may be. What would you say in response to any of that?
Well, as far as being properly equipped, one of the things that you have to go through whenever you're doing indoor air quality work like this, similar to a mold or asbestos or anything, is you have to be fit tested, both to make sure that your respiratory fits correctly, and that needs to be done by a professional that's certified. And you also need a medical clearance to make sure that you can operate with that type of respiratory apparatus on. So there are some situations, some certifications you need to go through even to put on the proper gear to work in this environment. And secondly, and one of the more tedious but difficult tasks that needs to be done is when you're doffing your PPE. When you go into a hazardous environment, you may be properly protected, but when you take your PPE off, if it's not taken off correctly, then you could expose yourself to the hazards that you've just been working in. So you really need
What do you mean by doffing? Just so that we have an understanding of that.
Technical term for that is donning and doffing. Donning, putting on your PPE, making sure that everything is properly sealed, that you don't have any exposure to the hazards that you're working in. Doffing is when you come out of that hazardous environment and you're taking your PPE off, your personal protection equipment. And it needs to be done in a certain sequence, and it needs to be done the same way every time to make sure that you're not exposing yourself to hazards that you just worked in. That's where the experience comes in.
And everybody has a different definition here, but I know that in talking to you, you talk about being clean, having clean surfaces, and as I mentioned before, deep cleaning. Can you describe what that means in your business?
Deep cleaning, when you see it referred to in the guidelines and everything else, it's similar to what you don't see when you're doing normal cleaning is that you're leaving organic matter and organic burden behind. It's similar to, I draw the analogy of trying to wax a dirty car. You don't disinfect the dirty surface. You have to clean it first. So a deep clean would be going through a facility with soap and water, a degreaser, and really hitting the high touch points, things that people are touching all day long, that they're leaving their oils of their hands or they're leaving things behind. And just simply hit that with the sanitizer disinfectant doesn't do it any good. You have to really get down to the bare surface, clean it very well, and then go and disinfect it for the disinfectant to be effective. That's the definition of a deep clean.
This goes back to one of the questions that Ken raised earlier. He suggested that you need to look at, the frequency of certain pathways in and out of the building or within the building itself. So when you go to approach a client and you're evaluating the premises to provide a service, what are the things that come to mind in terms of how you evaluate? Is one size fit all? Are facilities completely different? Is there a different protocol for different facility? How do you go about doing that?
Number of factors that play into that. Number one is, what is the contaminant that's involved, or are we strictly just doing a sanitary process before they reopen? The size of the building, how is the facility used? When does the work need to be done? Does it need to be done after hours? Do I need to work around the people that are there working? Can I do it in zones? So there's a lot of factors that come into play when you're assessing a facility to disinfect or sanitize it. There's not one size fits all by any stretch of the imagination. You have to look at each individual building separately. How you pick your disinfectants. If I go into a normal clubhouse and there's leather sofas and there's oil paintings, I'm completely changing my thought process on what disinfectant I'm using and how I'm going to apply it because of those furnishings and how it might affect it. So I'm looking for the compatibility of my chemicals with the environment. A number of factors that go into that decision.
So are there different chemicals that you would use in different environments?
Yes, sir, absolutely. Don't want to use a sledgehammer to kill a mosquito. So if it's, it depends on the application and what you're trying to do. A lot of times, if you can't introduce a fogging system into an environment, then everything is a wipe down and it's more labor intensive, which means it drives up the cost. So again, depending on the environment, that determines what chemical and how you apply it.
Keith, what if you've got, say, a card room at a high-end country club community, and there's lots of furnitures, and there's lots of artwork? Does that impact your choice, your selection of how you go about cleaning it?
Yeah, I mean, I think every location and every situation is going to be different. And, as Clay alluded to, I mean, where things are, what the frequency of use is, and how all of that comes together is going to determine how we're going to move forward with our cleaning process and the frequency at which we need to reclean.
What if you've got, what do you suggest? Packages are being delivered at a front desk of a hotel or the front desk of a community association. Is there anything that you guys would suggest that they do to treat those packages coming in at that point they enter the building?
Well, I would handle those packages with minimal PPE of gloves and a mask. If possible, I would at least spray it with a Lysol or something over-the-counter type of disinfectant at a minimum, if I could do that. But again, I think we're getting to the point where we're starting to use disinfectants for every little thing. And I think even using Lysol without a mask on, I think you have some problems there. So we're starting to go to the other side of the spectrum where we're just spraying everything. And we're not using common sense when it comes to introducing aerosols into the air all the time. But if practical, yes, I would spray down a package before I would send it up to the room.
Ken, what are you seeing in terms of what they're actually doing in these community associations? Because I know that everybody's getting a lot of packages delivered today, more so than they were 2 months ago. So are you seeing anything new and different that your clients are doing?
Packages are routinely delivered to the front door, and then the residents are being alerted to come down and retrieve them, whether it be food or groceries or an Amazon delivery or some other type of package. That's the way it's being handled because they don't want to allow all of the delivery personnel to be coming into and out of the building, accessing the elevator, accessing the hallways. Those that have a front desk and have interior common elements that are secure are having the packages left at the front.
Okay.
Now, if you have residents who have physical difficulties or handicaps or are quarantined because they came from the tri-state area or one of them is tested positive, some communities are typically allowing the staff to deliver the things to their door as opposed to going into their units. So for every protocol, there are obviously going to be exceptions that have to be considered. But that is the one exception for packages. If you have someone who is physically unable to leave their unit or is quarantined, then additional accommodations should be made.
Clay, when and thanks for that, Ken, because that guides us to the next question. You know, obviously, Clay, a company such as yours is not going to be there 24/7. So, is there some sort of protocol or training protocol that that would be best to provide to hotels, restaurants, community associations, country clubs, so that their own staff can be trained? How do you go about doing that?
I'm sure they're overwhelmed, but for the most part, I think the people that sell them their chemicals, the Ecolabs of the world or the Ciscos of the world, the distributors that are selling them their current product should be able to train them in the proper use of that. It's important that any disinfectant, any sanitizer is used as it's labeled or as it's instructed to on the back of it. If it's a concentrate and it needs to be diluted, we need to make sure that the people using that product understand that and are using it correctly. The only way that disinfectants and sanitizers work is if they use them as directed. So perhaps they could get that training from the suppliers.
All right, so you can come in there and you can maybe treat once and then maybe train other people to follow on and treat after you're gone. But when you go ahead and do a treatment of a facility, how long does it last? I mean, are there some facilities that have to have scheduled frequent treatment? What do you guys look at when you're making those recommendations to a client?
Depending on the use of the facility. I mean, it's an open-ended question, but a gym is only going to be as clean as until the next athlete comes in there that, you know, is contaminated. So that's the hard part about this. We don't know exactly how this pathogen spreads. We don't know for sure how long it lasts on a surface. They're suspect that it lasts as long as 9 days. So depending on the use of the facility, that's going to determine how frequently you have to clean it and sanitize it.
What about facilities where they're cleaned and then there's a reported case of somebody within the facility or within the building that has contracted COVID-19? Do they then routinely call you back and ask you to re-clean it again? When does it stop?
We do that every day. We are doing that in 500,000 square foot automobile manufacturing facilities. So what the clients are trying to do is to isolate where we need to clean by contact tracing and finding out where that positive person has been. And if they can nail that down, it reduces the size of the space that we need to clean. Contact tracing is going to be a big buzzword in the future because that's how they're going to track this and find out where that person has been to go interview those people. So if an association can tell us in the beginning, this is where we think that person was for the most part, then we can reduce the amount of cleaning that we need to do.
And how does this cleaning process actually interrupt the ongoing operations of a restaurant or a business or a community or a country club or a gym?
Depending on where we're cleaning, we may have to work after hours. They may have already closed the business down, and then we get in there as soon as we can so they can reopen. But it all depends on the facility and where it is that we are cleaning and treating. That determines how much access we need and for how long.
So Ken, we've heard a lot of the cleaning protocols that Clay and Keith have shared with us. Hearing that, any recommendations you have for your communities with respect to your views about the use of elevators? I know that is a big question that a lot of our audience has asked about using freight elevators. Some people said, can associations require the use of face masks in common areas? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts are that you should only open and provide access to the extent that you can properly clean and protect. The orders that we're seeing coming down from the counties, it bears repeating, do not require you to reopen. As a matter of fact, they say that you should only reopen facilities like the pool, and we're getting questions about the pools and the gyms. You should only reopen those if, in fact, you can safely enforce the protocols that are handed down in these executive orders and the safety protocols that are appropriate to protect your owners. If you cannot monitor it to ensure social distancing, if you cannot monitor it to ensure capacity, I mean, you asked your question about how these things disturb the restaurants and businesses and country clubs and community associations. Remember, almost all of these orders provide that these facilities can be reopened, but at typically no more than 50% capacity. So that makes it easier for you to clean, but in the most direct answer to your question I can offer, Steve, is only provide access to the extent that you are prepared to adopt and enforce a set of operating protocols, and to the extent you have the resources and the personnel to properly clean a couple times a day so that you keep your people safe.
You know, we have a question from Ned from Boca Raton. And Ned says, you know, I've got a lot of questions about contractors coming onto the property. Ken, you mentioned this in your introductory comments. And about, can we allow these contractors to come in? You know, the summer's here. That's when a lot of the renovation work is done because a lot of the snowbirds go back up north. My view is that, number one, is that the owner should not take on the responsibility for safety by the contractors, but should dictate the contractor has to follow these safety requirements, whether it be signal restoration doing work or a roofing contractor or somebody doing concrete restoration, which means social distancing. Although that's being relaxed now, especially if you're doing exterior type work, but if you're doing interior work, there are a number of things that come to mind. Number one, what you need to do is sorry about that.
That's
what you
okay.
need to do is you have to have restrictions on the use of common facilities so that no one's using your restrooms inside the building. You have to make sure that there's a path of egress that is clearly established so that no one is using that path of egress, or if they are, you can contact trace. And if somebody has been using that area that has the virus, then you can go ahead and you can have that area clean. So OSHA standards should be strictly enforced. There should be a zero tolerance standard in terms of what is set forth in executive guidelines in terms of contractors performing work. Because if someone gets sick as a result of exposure because of these people coming onto the property, then that's where the problem can arise, and that's where you can get liability on behalf of the association. Ken, do you have anything to add to that? Can these be more restrictive than that?
Well, I think the most important decision to most people when they're coming up with restrictions is what should be in the restriction. I believe the most important question should be, what are you prepared to enforce and how? Because it's one thing to have the adrenaline flowing through your veins as you come up with a 80-page book of restrictions, but you have to enforce it. And as an association, if you're going to allow access, first of all, you have to enforce the protocols that are set forth in the CDC guidelines and in the various state and county and municipal orders for reopening. Secondly, if somebody is doing a major renovation, for example, in their unit, and they're spending $80,000 on the renovation, and you have protocols in place that require their contractors to be in no earlier than 9, out no later than 5, wear face coverings when they're in the interior common elements, do not leave the unit during the day except to leave the property, and the contractors violate those protocols, what are you prepared to do about it? A $100 fine is not going to be much of a deterrent. I have recommended to clients that, as you said, Steve, a zero tolerance policy. If you have contractors who will not abide by your safety protocols, you stop the job. The first time they violate it, you stop the job for a day or two. The second time they violate it, you stop the job for a week or two. And the third time they violate it, they're done. They're off the property. The only way to make sure that you effectively protect your owners is not to wait a month before you can get in front of a judge or 2 weeks before you can get in front of a grievance committee. The way to stop this is to make sure that the contractors who are not abiding by your safety protocols are not let into the property until they understand that you mean business. And I suspect you'll only have to do that once.
So these are the serious consequences. And once again, I think when you recommend that this be communicated to all the residents so they know what the consequences are going to be?
You use the magic word, Steve, communicate. I said earlier that the board needs to constantly meet and evaluate these criteria. They have to constantly meet and discuss whether or not people are complying. And they have to constantly meet so that they can communicate to the owners what restrictions are remaining in place and why, and what restrictions are being relaxed subject to what conditions and why, and what the consequences will be. For example, if you have people who refuse to comply with the requirements in the county orders with regard to the pool, what you may have to do is shut down the pool. And I have to tell you, I have no compunction telling the community whose misbehavior caused us to shut down the pool.
You know, I think those are good tips. And I think people need to be told what to do and what the rules are. And I think as long as you demarcate them and get that out there communication-wise, I think you're in better shape. And also you set up this co-reliance on the business judgment and exercising reasonable due care. One other issue that cannot be overlooked, and I see a question from Jim from Orlando, he talked about insurance. You know, what insurance do we have? I think that it's just like any other construction project. Commercial general liability is a must, like any contractor should. But the one thing I will tell you, the most important facet of insurance to have right now is workers' compensation. Because if somebody who is working on the premises gets the virus, they're covered and you're covered. But there's always that link about the person who's a contractor who comes on the property and says, I don't have workers' comp, I'm exempt, I don't need to have it. And a lot of associations, a lot of owners say, oh, well, he must be under the law, so, you know, what's the big deal? Well, that is a big deal, because if that person gets sick, the owner could be exposed to liability for paying for the illness and the benefits they ordinarily would have got had been covered by workers' comp. It's also very, very difficult in this stage of the COVID-19. If someone's on the job and they don't get it on the job, but they go home and they get it from a roommate and they bring it back and then they infect 5 other people, all those 5 other people could be covered under workers' comp. So it's very important to have workers' compensation coverage. Yes, Ken.
Steve, if I could chime in on Jim's question. I don't know if Jim is a board member or manager or referring to his business, but the other insurance that you need to look at carefully and talk to your agent about is your liability insurance and your directors and officers liability insurance. Because the claims are going to come in 2 directions. The one claim will be for a loss of use of the property because I couldn't do my renovation. The other claim may be for a loss of income because I couldn't have let a tenant move in. And you need to find out what coverage you would have for those types of claims, but you also need to find out what coverage you will or will not have in the event that you relax your restrictions and someone gets sick. Now, I understand somebody out there is probably saying, well, how are they going to prove where they got sick? And I am telling you, if I'm your counsel, you don't want to have to contend with that question.
Very good point. I will tell you what, in any dialogue about insurance, my whole view from an owner's perspective is the first thing I do is I disclaim liability. Maybe I have them sign a waiver. If I can't do that, then I shift liability to somebody else. And if I can't do that, I mitigate my risk by taking steps like hiring a cleaning company, making sure that all these things are enforced. And if I can't do that, my last resort is I insure the risk. And I think it's a good time for owners of these projects to sit down with their broker and get an update about what coverage I have and what coverage will apply in the event of another pandemic in the future. There is some case law out there that talks about, and I think a lot of policies have been written where they do not exclude, they exclude as an exclusion from their policy, bacteria or mold or mildew, but they may not exclude a virus. If they don't exclude a virus, it very well could be that if you need to clean the premises because a virus has been found in the premises and COVID-19 is in the premises, it's been caught by people in the premises that necessitates a cleaning, the virus on the property itself could be deemed property damage. And therefore, an insurance company may have to pay for that cleaning of your facility in the event that happens. It's really important now to check your insurance policies to see what you have and what you don't have. So that's a good way to, it's a good time to check up on what you have at this point in time. The same goes true if you have business interruption insurance. Oftentimes you have to show some sort of property damage, the virus on the furnishings, the material that caused you a loss and a shutdown. That could be property damage too. He is, like with a hurricane and anything else, keep good record, keep your receipts, keep your invoices, keep your proof of cleaning. And I know that Signal Restoration does that repeatedly with respect to their hurricane claims. But how do you guard yourself against a lawsuit coming? We've talked about a lot of things. I think one of the key takeaways that I think exists is showing reasonable due care and exercising business judgment rule. If you have warnings that you post on signage within your community saying, you know, don't go in here, we're limiting to 10 people, we're limiting to 50 people, take pictures of that so you have a going record of what steps you took to protect the community. Take temperatures, photograph what the procedures are as they are in place, and save these records in the cloud. Also, put restrictions and publish them on contractors coming into the building, and also document that and communicate to your residents. Ken, anything else that you can think of?
Well, it is important to communicate and document, and since you typically do not have a direct contractual relationship with the contractor, you need to ask the contractor to sign a document acknowledging what the protocols are. There is no way you can protect entirely against this. I think you have to look for ways to work with your owners, but your paramount concern, and I apologize for being redundant, but your paramount concern has to be life safety. That has to come first. By the way, Steve, one more thing. As you decide on reopening, the discussion you just had about insurance should have an impact on your decision as a board or as a business owner as to how safely you can reopen and how you should effectuate reopening.
Shouldn't you also can make it part of a record? If you're a board of directors, you're running a business, or if you're a condominium association or a country club, shouldn't you have minutes of a meeting where you talk about the various executive orders? You talk about hiring Signal Restoration and what they've done for you and the results of their cleaning and their findings and the restrictions that you've been imposed, and moving from a shutdown to a gradual reopening as opposed to an opening all at once. Shouldn't all that be part of the record in, you know, making a record?
That's part of exercising business judgment, Steve. I absolutely agree. The business judgment rule made its way into the community association realm when the courts started to see lawsuits over whether or not we really need to replace the roof, or whether or not we really need to do this concrete restoration. And the court said that as long as the board is exercising reasonable business judgment, we're not going to be the final decision maker on whether or not your condo needs a new roof or whether or not it needs to do concrete restoration. As long as the board has consulted with experts and is making decisions based upon the advice of competent licensed experts, the courts are not going to substitute their judgment for that of the board on how to operate the property. So the best way to be able to argue that you are exercising reasonable business judgment is to get expert advice and make your decisions in reliance on that advice.
Well, there's also a couple other things we can do, and we'll go around the horn here and talk about next steps and moving forward and what it's like. But my view is that in any contract that I'm doing from a construction standpoint, I have a mutual force majeure clause, which means it's just not a force majeure to relieve the contractor from doing stuff, but it's also a force majeure clause that gives the owner relief from any obligations it may also have under the contract. And you don't want to terminate the contract for force majeure, maybe you want that option. But what you want to do is maybe have a provision to suspend performance and then come back once the pandemic, for example, has ended. You also want to include viruses as well as pandemics within your force majeure clause, and also have local, state, and national emergencies that are declared be deemed a force majeure. You also want to have your records retention, as I mentioned, and to exercise the business judgment that Ken said. And also, I think most importantly, meet with your insurance broker, because maybe some of the cleaning expenses you may incur may be recoverable as well as other damages. Ken, anything else?
Well, my parting comment, and I'm hearing this a lot from my clients, Steve, is, our neighbors are allowing this, our neighbors are allowing that. They never stopped housekeepers. It reminds me of when we were all very young, and we said to our mothers or our fathers, well, my friend Joe, he's smoking cigarettes or doing something else. And at that point, your parent would say to you, well, if your friend Joe jumped off a cliff, would you follow him off the cliff? You have to make decisions as to how to contend with this reopening based upon your building, based upon your facilities, based upon your demographics, based upon your staffing and your ability to do so safely. Do not assume that what your neighbors are doing is the right fit for you. Make decisions based upon what works for your building, the number of elevators you have, the hallways that you have, the age and demographic of your residents, the prevalence of residents with underlying health conditions, and of course, the staff. You have to take a holistic view of your building. Again, what goes on in the buildings next door to you really have very little impact on what should go on in your building.
Keith, what do you think, what takeaway can you give our audience in terms from Signal's standpoint with respect to the types of topics that we've been talking about today? What are the takeaways?
Yeah, Steve, I asked the guys and gals to take a very conservative approach when approaching how they handle the COVID-19 scenario. And in regards to that, make sure that your contractors are trained and have some experience in handling the COVID-19 restoration during that process, so that you've got a clean facility when they leave.
Clay, how about you? What suggestions do you have?
Well, I think the days of just cleaning a facility are long gone. We no longer can get by with just it smells good, it looks good, it must be clean. Now we have to talk about the safety of a building. Is it healthy to go into a building? So we need to look at our existing standard operating procedures and find out if there's some holes in there. Does your staff know what they're doing? Are they doing it following the procedure? And adjusting to that and making sure we're creating a healthy environment, not just a clean environment in the public spaces.
Yeah, I think that it seems to me that if we've learned anything from this, is that business and the way that we handle our facilities and maintain them is going to change. That there's going to be a need for more frequent cleaning, and there's going to be a need for more of a robust training program for the people that these facilities hire when they're doing business. And what about, what can you tell us about, in summing up, about the communication? Because I think that's an important point that needs to be stressed.
Was that for me, Steve?
Yes.
A lot of boards enacted these protocols on an emergency basis, but we're now more than 2 months into this. You should be having noticed board meetings. You should be having open board meetings. I certainly concur with the boards that don't want to have a room full of people. And frankly, a lot of the board members are spread out. but use technology like we're using here. Use telephone conferencing. Try as best you can to facilitate participation. Steve made the point in his opening comments that communication tends to have a good effect on the rumor mill and on the skepticism and the resentment and the mistrust. So to the extent that you can have open meetings and allow people to attend digitally, you should do so. You should look for input from the owners, and you should communicate. You should over-communicate. Let me put it that way. You should err on the side of over-communicating with your owners as to what's going on. And the board discussions should, to the fullest extent possible, be open to the owners, even if it's through digital means. For the board members out there, one of the beauties of having Zoom is that little button at the top that says mute. For the people who interrupt the board and try to take over meetings and filibuster meetings, you tell people, okay, you're being redundant, or you're yelling at us, or you're swearing at us. You can mute them. Owners have the right to attend board meetings and speak to all agenda items. No one has the right to disrupt or monopolize a board meeting. And I really think that one of the things that a lot of the communities have learned as a result of this crisis is that this sort of technology can facilitate owner attendance and participation, and it should be something you factor into your operational planning going forward.
Thank you, Ken. I would like to conclude this webinar by saying this. I want to thank Ken, as well as Keith and Clay, for some great input on how to maneuver through this pandemic. For all the attendees today, you will be receiving a checklist with some takeaways from the program itself. We thank you for joining us today. We hope you found it to be informative. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Steve.